Some jerk threatened to harm a cat, so I drove 6 hours to handle it personally. When I answered my phone, the sound on the other end wasn't even words at first, just ragged breathing and a terrifying wheeze. It was Chloe, my girlfriend's best friend. "He's going to kill her," she finally choked out. "He's going to kill my cat." I asked who, where she was, and what had happened. The story came out in jagged pieces. She'd finally broken up with her boyfriend, Victor, a guy built like a shipping container who I'd met once and immediately hated. He hadn't handled the split well. He beat her until she blacked out, dragged her unconscious body outside into the snow, and locked her out of her own place. Now he was inside destroying everything she owned. Then her voice went hollow. He told her if he heard a single siren or saw a cop, and the cat was dead first. My girlfriend was already on a plane for a business trip, and I knew she'd expect me to do whatever it took to save her friend. I told Chloe I was coming. She lived 6 hours away. I grabbed my girlfriend's industrial taser and the Glock I keep legally locked in my vehicle. I'd never fired it outside of range, and I hoped tonight wouldn't change that. 6 hours is a long time to think. Direct confrontation was a bad move. Victor had 80 pounds on me and hands like bricks. Calling the police immediately was also out unless I wanted a dead cat. Chloe kept texting updates. He threw her TV out the window. He smashed every dish. He screamed that the cat was next. Every text made my foot heavy on the gas. I told her to stay hidden and stay awake. The temp was sub-zero, and she was locked out in nothing but silk pajamas. She said she couldn't feel her fingers. I told her I was almost there. I made the drive in under 5 hours. I pulled up around 4 a.m. and found her huddled against the brick, shivering so hard her teeth were rattling. Her left eye was swollen shut, her cheek was deep purple, and her lips were a shade of blue that made my blood run cold. Suddenly, a second-story window flew open. Victor's massive frame appeared, and he hurled a heavy lamp that shattered on the pavement. He roared something and slammed the window. The rage I felt was cold and focused. I got Chloe into my car and cranked the heat. I pressed my keys into her frozen hands. "If you hear a shot, you drive," I said. "Don't wait. Just get somewhere safe and call 911. She nodded through her tears. I told her to call the cops in exactly 15 minutes. I headed for the building. The fire escape was slick with ice, but I climbed to the second floor. Victor had left the window cracked. I slipped inside into a hallway covered in glass. The place looked like a war zone. I spotted Chloe's tabby hiding under an overturned shelf, wide-eyed. At least the cat was safer now. I crept forward. Victor was in the living room with his back to me, holding a heavy planter over his head. I closed the gap in 3 steps and pressed the taser to his neck. 50,000 volts dropped him, but not completely. He was on his knees, gasping and swinging wildly. His fist caught my leg and I stumbled. He started crawling toward a knife lock on the kitchen counter. I pulled my Glock. Victor heard that distinct click and turned into a statue, one hand frozen inches from a handle. I told him if he moved again, and I'd be giving the cops one less person to process. He stayed still. Smart move. Sirens hit 90 seconds later. When the police burst in, I had my hands up, weapon on the floor, and permit ready. They found Victor on the floor, the trashed apartment, and Chloe's statement waiting outside. They took him away in cuffs. The paramedic said Chloe had early-stage hypothermia, but she eventually recovered. The cat was shaken, but fine. I stayed in town for a week, helping Chloe get new locks, fresh furniture, and a restraining order that stuck. The silence in that apartment after the police hauled Victor out was heavier than the noise of the destruction he'd left behind. My hands were finally shaking. Not from fear, but from the massive crash of adrenaline leaving my system. I looked down at the Glock on the floor, and now being bagged as evidence by a somber-looking officer. I'd done it. I hadn't pulled the trigger, but I'd looked into the eyes of a monster and didn't blink. "You the one who called?" an officer asked, his notebook out. "No, she did," I said, gesturing toward the window where the flashing blue lights reflected off the frost. "She's in my car. She needs a hospital." I watched them carry Chloe into the ambulance. She was wrapped in 3 shock blankets, her small frame looking even smaller against the gurney. The cat, a little ginger tabby named Mochi, was tucked into a carrier I'd found in the wreckage. As the sirens faded, I stood in the middle of the ruined living room. The air was freezing, coming in through the broken windows, smelling of ozone, expensive perfume from a shattered bottle, and raw aggression. The next morning, I was sitting in a plastic chair in the hospital waiting room, nursing a lukewarm coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. My girlfriend, Elena, had landed, and her messages were a frantic stream of consciousness. "I'm getting a flight to her now. Is she okay? Is Mochi okay? Did you have to use it?" I didn't know how to answer the last part. I just told her they were safe. When the doctors let me see Chloe, she looked like a different person. The swelling in her eye had peaked, a deep, angry hematoma that made her look like she'd been in a high-speed accident. But when she saw me, her one good eye welled up. "You actually came," she whispered. Her voice was a dry rasp. 6 hours. "You actually came. I told you I was almost there," I said, pulling my chair closer. "Mochi is at a 24-hour vet for a checkup. She's fine, Chloe. She's just a little grumpy." A small, painful smile touched her bruised lips. "Victor, he kept saying no one cared. He kept saying he could do whatever he wanted because I had no one left. He was wrong," I said firmly. The next few days were a blur of bureaucratic nightmares and domestic recovery. I didn't drive home. I couldn't leave her like that. I checked into a cheap motel nearby and spent my days at Chloe's apartment. It was a visceral kind of work, sweeping up the shards of her old life to make room for a new one. I spent 4 hours picking glass out of the carpet so the cat wouldn't cut her paws. I hauled the smashed TV to the dumpster. I bought a new door frame and spent an afternoon with a wood chisel and a hammer, my muscles aching, fixing the entry Victor had kicked in. Every strike of the hammer felt like I was pounding a nail into the coffin of her trauma. On the 3rd day, Elena arrived. The reunion was silent and tearful. She spent hours just holding Chloe while I sat in the kitchen, staring at the new locks I'd installed. My mind kept looping back to that moment in the hallway. The weight of the taser, the click of the Glock, the look in Victor's eyes when he realized his size didn't matter anymore. "You're different," Elena said that night after Chloe had finally fallen asleep. We were sitting on the floor of the half-empty living room, sharing a pizza. "I feel the same," I lied. "No, you're quieter. Your hands, they haven't stopped moving since I got here." I looked down. I was fidgeting with a loose thread on my sleeve. I just keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd hit traffic, or if I'd stayed in bed and told her to call the cops herself. He would have killed that cat, Elena, and then he would have finished what he started with her. "But you didn't stay in bed," she said, leaning her head on my shoulder. The legal fallout was the hardest part. The restraining order was a given, but Victor had friends. I started getting blocked number calls at 2 a.m. No one spoke. Just that same heavy breathing I'd heard from Chloe on the night of the attack. I didn't tell her. I just stayed. I stayed until the apartment felt like a home again instead of a crime scene. On my last day in town, I took Chloe and Mochi to a new apartment she'd found on the other side of the city. It was a gated complex with security cameras and a heavy steel door. So I walked through every room with her, checking the windows, showing her how the new alarm system worked. As I was loading the last of my gear into my car, Chloe came out to the driveway. She wasn't shivering anymore. She looked me in the eyes, the purple fading to a dull yellow. "I don't know how to pay you back for this," she said. "Don't," I replied. "Just keep the door locked and keep the cat inside." I drove the 6 hours back home in a daze. The highway was empty, the sun setting in a brilliant bloody orange over the horizon. When I finally walked into my own house, I put the the Glock back in its safe and locked it. I looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. I looked like an ordinary guy. A guy who works a desk job, who tips 20%, who worries about car payments. But I knew better now. I knew exactly what I was capable of when the world got dark and the breathing on the other end of the line went ragged. I wasn't a hero, but I wasn't a bystander anymore either. I went into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and sat in the dark, watching the streetlights flicker on outside. My phone buzzed. It was a photo from Chloe, Mochi, curled up on a new, soft rug in a sunlit room. She's purring, the caption read. I put the phone down, and finally, for the first time in a week, I slept. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in hypervigilance. I was back in my own city, back in my own bed, but the 6-hour drive felt like it had stretched into a permanent distance between who I was before and who I was now. Every time a car slowed down too much in front of my house, or a floorboard creaked in the middle of the night, but I was back in that frozen hallway, feeling the weight of the Glock in my hand. Then the subpoena arrived. The state was charging Victor with multiple counts of felony assault, breaking and entering, and animal cruelty. Because I was the one who had neutralized him and held him until the police arrived, I was the star witness. You don't have to go back alone, Elena said, looking at the official envelope on the kitchen table. I'll take the time off. We'll get a hotel. We'll stay away from the old neighborhood. I have to go, I said. It wasn't about the law. It was about seeing the look in his eyes when he wasn't holding a planter over a cat's head. I needed to see him small. The drive back felt shorter this time. The sub-zero temperatures had given way to a gray, slushy thaw. We met Chloe at a small diner near the courthouse. She looked better. The physical bruises were gone, but she kept her back to the wall and her eyes on the door. She'd lost weight. Her hands, once steady enough for her work as a graphic designer, had a slight, persistent tremor. His lawyer is going to try to make you look like the aggressor, Chloe warned me, her voice low. They're going to talk about the taser, the gun. They're going to say you're some vigilante who drove 6 hours looking for a fight. Let them, I said. The photos of your face and the state of that apartment say otherwise. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. It felt cramped, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and floor wax. When Victor was let in, he wasn't wearing the heavy work jacket he'd had on that night. He was in a cheap, ill-fitting suit that made his massive frame look even more imposing. And he scanned the gallery, and for a split second his eyes locked onto mine. There was no remorse there, just a flat, predatory stillness. When I was called to the stand, the defense attorney, a man who looked like he'd spent his entire career arguing that gravity was an opinion, approached me with a smirk. Mr. Thompson, he began, you're a resident of a completely different city, correct? 6 hours away? Correct. And yet, upon receiving a phone call, you didn't call the authorities in that city? You didn't suggest your friend call 911 immediately? She told me he threatened to kill her cat if he heard sirens. I didn't want to gamble with a life. So you decided to play hero, the lawyer sneered. You packed a tactical taser, a loaded firearm. You drove hundreds of miles with the specific intent of engaging in a violent confrontation. Isn't it true, Mr. Thompson, that you were looking for an excuse to use those weapons? I looked at the jury. They were ordinary people. A nurse, a retired teacher, a guy in a flannel shirt. I thought about the no-tip buttons and the moral transactions of my daily life. This was the ultimate transaction. I drove 6 hours hoping I wouldn't have to use them, I said, my voice steady. I drove 6 hours because a woman was being beaten and a helpless animal was being used as leverage. I didn't go there to be a hero. I went there to be a friend. If I wanted to be a vigilante, I wouldn't have put the gun down the second the police arrived. I wouldn't have waited for the law. I was the bridge between her surviving and her becoming a statistic. The lawyer tried to bait me for another 20 minutes, but the fire was gone. The facts were too loud. The photos were entered into evidence. The smashed furniture, the blood on the snow, the image of Mochi cowering under the shelf. Victor was found guilty on all counts. He didn't make a scene when the verdict was read. He just stared at the table. As they led him out, he looked back one last time, but I didn't look away. I didn't feel the need to hide. That night, back at the hotel, Chloe sat on the edge of the bed while Elena packed our bags. It's over, Chloe said, almost as if she didn't believe it. It's over, I agreed. I keep thinking about the cat, she said, a small laugh escaping her. 6 hours for a cat. People think you're crazy. You know, maybe I am, I said, looking at Elena. But I think the world would be a lot better if more people were crazy enough to show up when the phone rings at 3 a.m. We drove home the next morning. The debt was still there. The baby was still coming. The car was still making that faint, annoying hum on the highway. I was still just an ordinary guy. But as I pulled into my driveway and saw the house I'd worked so hard for, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. I checked my phone. A message from the vet back in Chloe's town had forwarded some records. I deleted it, then scrolled to a photo Chloe had sent of Mochi. The cat was sitting in a windowsill, watching the birds, completely unaware that the world had almost ended for her. I walked inside, kissed my pregnant wife, and started making dinner. I didn't think about the tip. I didn't think about the Glock. I just thought about how good it felt to be home. The aftermath of the trial didn't bring the immediate happily ever after I'd expected. Justice is a clean word, but the reality is messy, lingering like the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. Victor was behind bars, but the shadow he cast was long, and it reached all the way back to our quiet suburb. About a month after the sentencing, the breather calls started again. They weren't coming from a jail cell. Victor was locked down tight, but he had associates, men who looked like him, moved like him, and shared his skewed sense of loyalty. I'd be sitting at my desk at work, and my phone would buzz. No caller ID, just that rhythmic, wet rasp of someone listening to me breathe. I didn't tell Sarah, not at first, and she was 36 weeks along now, and her world was supposed to be about crib sheets and nursing pillows, not the threat of some low-life seeking revenge for a brother I'd helped put away. I'd catch her looking at me sometimes, her eyes narrowing as she watched me check the locks for the third time before bed. Mark, she said one evening, her voice soft but firm. You're doing it again. Doing what? I asked, testing the deadbolt on the back door. Living in that hallway. You're back in Chloe's apartment. You haven't been here for days. I sat down at the kitchen table, the weight of the secret finally becoming too much. The calls started again, Sarah. They know where we live. They know who I am. The color drained from her face, but she didn't cry. She just leaned back in her chair, her hand resting on her stomach. Please, what do we do? We don't run, I said, and the coldness of my own voice surprised me. I'm not driving 6 hours away this time. This is my house. This is where my daughter is going to live. I spent the next week turning our home into a fortress. I didn't care about the budget anymore. The $412 in our checking account was a joke, so I leaned into the debt. I installed a hardwired security system with motion-activated floods that could turn the backyard into high noon at midnight. I bought a heavy-duty safe for the Glock and moved it from the car to the bedroom. Every purchase felt like a betrayal of the life we'd tried to build, but every click of a new lock felt like a heartbeat of safety. Then the first physical sign appeared. I walked out to the driveway on a Tuesday morning to find a dead bird placed neatly on the windshield of my car. Its neck had been snapped. There were no prints, no notes, just the message. My first instinct was to call the police, but I knew what they'd say. It's a neighborhood cat, sir, or a prank. We can't file a report over a bird. I cleaned it off with a paper towel, my stomach churning, and drove to work with the windows rolled up and the doors locked. I called Chloe that afternoon. Are you seeing anything? Anyone following you? No, she said, sounding breathless. Mark, what's happening? Is everything okay? Just stay alert. If you see a car twice, call me. Don't go to the park alone. I hung up and stared at my computer screen. My job, analyzing logistics for a shipping firm, felt like a fever dream. How was I supposed to care about the transit time of a container from Shanghai when someone was leaving dead animals on my car? The escalation happened faster than I anticipated. Friday night, Sarah was asleep upstairs. I was in the living room, the lights dimmed, watching the feed from the front porch camera on my phone. At 2:14 a.m., the motion light triggered. A figure was standing at the end of the driveway. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie that obscured his face. He didn't move toward the house. He just stood there, staring directly into the lens of the camera. He raised a hand, pointed a finger like a gun, and mimicked a recoil. Then he turned and walked calmly back into the darkness. I didn't call the cops. I knew this guy. Not his name, but his type. He was waiting for me to break, waiting for me to show fear. I grabbed the Glock from the safe, checked the magazine, and sat by the window. I didn't sleep. I watched the sun come up, the gray light of dawn revealing the quiet suburban street that now felt like a battlefield. The next day, I went to the one place I'd been avoiding, a local boxing gym in the basement of an old warehouse. It smelled of sweat, old leather, and desperation. I found the owner, a guy named Mac, who looked like he'd been hit by a truck and survived. I need to know how to handle someone bigger than me, I said, without the gun. Mac looked at my soft hands, my office worker posture. You got a problem? I have a family, I said. That's the best reason there is. Wrap your hands. For the next 3 weeks, I lived a double life. During the day, I was the expectant father, the logistics guy, the man who worried about the price of coffee. In the evenings, I was a punching bag. Mac taught me how to use my weight, how to see a punch coming before it left the shoulder, and how to stay calm when the world starts spinning. My ribs were perpetually bruised. My knuckles were raw, but the shaking in my hands finally stopped. I was becoming something I didn't recognize. The automatic tipper was gone. The guy who felt guilty about hitting no tip was a ghost. I was focused, lean, and dangerous in a way that scared me when I looked in the mirror. Sarah noticed the change. She saw the bruises I tried to hide under long sleeves. She heard me practicing my footwork in the garage at midnight. Mark, this has to stop, she said, her voice trembling. You're turning into him. You're turning into Victor. No, I said, pulling her into a hug. Victor hurts people to feel powerful. I'm doing this so no one can ever hurt us again. There's a difference. Is there? She whispered into my chest. Because you don't look at me the same way anymore. You're always looking past me, at the door, at the window. She was right, but I couldn't stop. The calls were coming every night now. Sometimes they'd play a recording of a baby crying. Sometimes it was just the sound of a knife being sharpened. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday. I was driving home from the gym when I noticed a black SUV 2 cars back. It followed me through 3 turns, maintaining a perfect, menacing distance. I didn't go home. I headed for the industrial district. The streets empty and slick with oil. I pulled into a dead-end alley behind a row of abandoned silos and killed the engine. I reached into the glove box and pulled out the industrial taser, the one I'd used on Victor. I stepped out of the car, the rain soaking through my shirt in seconds. The SUV pulled in behind me, blocking the exit. The headlights stayed on, blinding me. Come on, I screamed into the glare. You want to talk? Let's talk. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He wasn't Victor, but he was his twin in spirit. Wide shoulders, scarred knuckles, a face that had seen too many fights. He didn't have a gun. He had a crowbar. You're a long way from home, college boy, he said, his voice a low growl. And you're a long way from a witness, I countered. He lunged. He was fast for his size, the crowbar whistling through the air. I dodged, the metal catching the sleeve of my jacket. I didn't use the taser. Not yet. I used what Mac had taught me. I stepped into his guard, drove my elbow into his ribs, and felt the satisfying thud of impact. He gasped, swinging the crowbar back blindly. It caught me in the shoulder, a blinding flash of pain radiating down my arm. I stumbled, the wet pavement slick under my boots. He was over me in a second, the crowbar raised for a finishing blow. I fired the taser. The prongs buried themselves in his chest, and 50,000 volts slammed into his nervous system. He collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, the crowbar clattering away into the darkness. He lay there, twitching, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I stood over him, my chest heaving, the rain washing the blood from my knuckles. I could have finished it. I could have ended the threat right there. The alley was dark, no cameras, no witnesses. I looked at the man on the ground. He was a pawn, a thug sent to do the dirty work of a man behind bars. If I killed him, another would come, and another. I reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. I scrolled through his recent calls until I found the number he'd been using to harass me. I hit call and waited. Is it done? A voice answered. It wasn't Victor. It was someone higher up. It's done, I said, my voice cold and clear. But not the way you think. Your boy is on the ground. I have his phone. I have his plates. And I have a recording of this conversation. If I see so much as a shadow near my house again, I'm not calling the cops. I'm coming for you. And I don't drive 6 hours just to talk. I hung up and smashed the phone under my heel. I didn't wait for him to wake up. I got back in my car and drove home. When I walked through the front door, Sarah was standing in the hallway, her hands over her mouth. She saw the blood on my shirt, the look in my eyes. It's over, I said. Truly over this time. I went upstairs, took a long, hot shower, and scrubbed the grime of the alley from my skin. I looked at my hands. They were shaking again, but this time it was okay. The ordinary guy was still there, somewhere under the bruises and the scar tissue. The call stopped. The dead birds stopped. The black SUV disappeared from the neighborhood. 2 weeks later, Sarah went into labor. As I sat in that hospital room, watching the nurses move with their quiet efficiency, I thought about the journey it had taken to get here. I thought about the tips I hadn't paid, the fights I'd won, and the man I'd become. When they finally handed me Maya, she felt impossibly light. She was the reason for the walls, the reason for the safe, the reason for the blood on the pavement. She looks like you, Sarah whispered, her face pale but glowing. I hope not, I said, kissing the baby's forehead. I hope she never has to be like me. I looked at the discharge coordinator when she came in with her tablet. I looked at the suggested contribution screen. I didn't feel the old anger. I didn't feel the shame. I just hit no and handed the tablet back with a polite smile. I didn't need a fund to tell me I was a good man. I didn't need a percentage to prove I cared. I had protected my family. I had stood my ground. And as we walked out of the hospital and into the bright morning sun, I knew that for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The first 3 months of Maya's life were a blur of sleep deprivation and the kind of mundane peace that feels like a luxury after a war. The security cameras still hummed, and the Glock remained in the safe, but the adrenaline had finally ebbed away, leaving a strange, hollow quiet in its wake. Sarah and I had found a rhythm. I handled the 2 a.m. feedings, sitting in the dark living room with the blue light of the monitor reflecting off the walls. I no longer watched the perimeter for shadows. I watched the rise and fall of my daughter's chest. Then, a Saturday morning in late May brought a familiar car into our driveway. It was Chloe. She hadn't just come to visit. She was moving. She'd found a job in our city, a fresh start that didn't involve 6-hour drives or looking over her shoulder at every gas station. When she stepped out of the car, she looked older, more grounded. Mochi's carrier was in the back seat, the cat peering out with curious, slid eyes. I couldn't stay there, Chloe said, as we held helped her unload the first round of boxes. Every time I went to the grocery store, I felt like I was walking through a graveyard of bad memories. I needed to be near people who show up. We spent the afternoon turning our guest room into a temporary staging area for her life. Seeing her hold Maya was a surreal closing of a circle. The last time I'd seen Chloe's hands, they were frozen blue against a brick wall. Now they were steady, supporting the head of a 3-month-old girl. She's perfect, Mark, Chloe whispered. She's expensive, I joked, though the humor had a bit of a sharp edge. The credit card debt was still a mountain, and the value supermarket had become my primary place of worship. That evening, after Maya was down and Sarah had retreated to bed for some much-needed rest, Chloe and I sat on the back porch. The motion lights flickered on as a moth fluttered past, illuminating the yard I'd patrolled like a sentry just weeks before. I heard about the SUV, Chloe said suddenly. I froze, a beer halfway to my mouth. Sarah told you? No. I checked the news back home. Some guy associated with Victor's old crew was found at a hospital with taser burns and broken ribs. He wouldn't say who did it, but he told the cops he was retiring from the business. And the word on the street is that Victor's people think this area is poisoned. I took a long pull of the beer, feeling the cold liquid settle the sudden tightness in my chest. I didn't want it to go that far, but it did, and because of that I can sleep at night, Chloe said. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. You saved me twice, Mark. Once from him, and once from the fear of him. But I see the way you look at the door. I see the way you check your phone every time it vibrates. It's a habit, I said. It's a cost, she countered. You stop tipping the world, but you're still paying a price. You're paying in pieces of yourself. She was right. I felt it in my shoulders, a permanent tension that wouldn't let go. I felt it in my social life, which had withered to almost nothing. I didn't trust people easily anymore. I didn't see a server. I saw a potential confrontation. I didn't see a stranger. I saw a threat. A few days later, Chloe invited us out to dinner. She insisted on paying, wanting to celebrate her new job. She picked a small, family-owned Italian place. No tablets, no pre-selected percentages, just paper menus and a smell of garlic that hit you at the door. The owner, a man in his 60s named Leo, took our order. He moved slowly, his knees popping with every step, but he knew the menu by heart. He didn't rush us. He didn't hover. When Maya started to fuss, he brought over a small piece of chilled dough for her to gum on, a trick he said worked for his 7 grandkids. When the bill came, Chloe reached for her purse, but I caught the total. It was $85. I watched as Leo set the leather folder on the table. There was no Care Excellence Fund, no suggested gratuity breakdown, just a handwritten total and a line for a tip. I felt the old anxiety rise up, the ghost of the automatic tipper wrestling with a man who owed $10,000. I looked at Leo, who was leaning against the bar, wiping a glass and laughing at something a regular had said. He wasn't performing. He was just there. I've got the tip, I said, reaching for my wallet before Chloe could protest. I pulled out 2 $20 bills and tucked them into the folder. It was nearly 50%. Sarah looked at me, her eyebrows raised. Mark, I thought we were done with that. We are, I said, and for the first time, I felt like I wasn't lying. I'm not doing this because I'm afraid of what he'll think. I'm not doing it because a screen told me to. I'm doing it because he made our night better. He treated us like neighbors, not targets. As we walked out, Leo caught my eye and gave a small, respectful nod. No big show, no fake have a blessed day, just a silent acknowledgement between two men. The drive home felt different. The poison Chloe had talked about seemed to have thinned out, but life has a way of reminding you that peace is a fragile thing. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed a white van parked 2 houses down. It was unmarked, the engine idling, the exhaust pluming in the cool night air. My hand went instinctively to the door lock. My eyes went to the side mirror. The soldier in me was back in an instant, heart rate spiking, scanning for a weapon, a face, a threat. Mark, Sarah said, her voice warning. Stay in the car, I whispered. I stepped out. Then my body coiled, my hand near the small of my back where I used to carry. I walked toward the van, my footsteps silent on the pavement. The driver's window rolled down. A young guy, maybe 20, looked out at me. He was wearing a high-vis vest and holding a tablet. Hey man, sorry, I'm just finishing my route. My GPS is acting up and I'm trying to find the 400 block of Miller. I stopped. I looked at him. Just a kid trying to get through his shift. He wasn't a thug. He wasn't a ghost from Victor's past. He was just a guy. 2 blocks that way, I said, pointing north. Left at the light. Thanks, man. Have a good one. He shifted into gear and pulled away. I stood in the middle of the street for a long time, watching his taillights disappear. The silence of the suburb rushed back in, but it didn't feel menacing. Yes, it just felt like night. I walked back to the car. Sarah was watching me through the glass, her expression a mix of pity and fear. I got back in and gripped the steering wheel. It was just a delivery guy, I said. I know, she replied. But you didn't. I realized then that the war wasn't over. It had just moved inward. Victor was in prison. The thugs were gone, and the debt was being paid off dollar by dollar. But the ordinary guy was still buried deep under layers of armor I'd built to survive the last year. I think I need to talk to someone, Sarah, I admitted. Professional. Someone who isn't Mac at the gym. She reached over and squeezed my hand. I've been waiting for you to say that. Chloe moved into her own apartment the following week. We helped her set up the last of her furniture, a heavy oak desk she'd bought at a thrift store. As I was leaving, she handed me a small envelope. What's this? I asked. A tip, she said with a wink. I opened it in the car. It was a photo of the 3 of us from the night before sitting at Leo's. We were all smiling. Maya was asleep in the stroller, and for once, I wasn't looking at the door. I was looking at my family. On the back, Chloe had written, "The debt is paid, Mark. Stop counting." I tucked the photo into the sun visor right next to the ultrasound. I started the car, checked my blind spot habitually, but without the panic, and drove home. The clicking in the car was gone. The bills were on the table. The baby was crying. It was a beautiful, noisy, expensive life, and for the first time in a long time, I was okay with paying the price. The peace lasted exactly 4 months. It ended on a humid Tuesday afternoon in August. I was sitting in my office, finally making headway on a complex logistics route for a client in Hamburg, when my personal phone buzzed on the desk. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was from Chloe's old town. Mark Thompson? The voice was clipped. Professional. A woman. Speaking. "This is Detective Sarah Miller with the county prosecutor's office. I worked on the Victor Volkov case. I wanted to give you a courtesy call before the news hit the registry." I felt a cold drop of sweat slide down my spine. I pushed away from my desk, my heart already accelerating. "What happened? Did he escape?" "No," she said, and I heard her sigh. "Yes, but there was a procedural error regarding the search warrant for the initial sweep of the apartment, specifically the digital evidence found on his phone. His defense team filed an omnibus motion. The long and short of it is, the judge vacated the animal cruelty and the breaking and entering charges. The felony assault still stands, but with time served and good behavior in the state facility. Victor is being released on parole, effective tomorrow." The office around me seemed to blur. The sound of the cooling fans, the muffled chatter of my co-workers, the ringing of a distant phone, it all became white noise. Tomorrow? He beat a woman until she was blue. He trashed her life. He threatened to kill a helpless animal. And he's out in less than a year? I'm sorry, Mark, the system isn't perfect. There's a mandatory restraining order in place, and he's barred from leaving his county of residence for the first 6 months. But I felt you and Chloe deserved to know. I hung up without saying goodbye. I stood up up, grabbed my jacket, and walked out of the building. I didn't tell my boss. I didn't check out. I just walked. The air outside was thick and heavy, the kind of heat that makes everything feel like it's moving through molasses. I got into my car and sat there, gripping the wheel. My knuckles, the ones I'd spent weeks hardening at Mac's gym, were white. Victor was out. The man who had been the catalyst for my descent into a world of tasers, alleyway fights, and hypervigilance was back on the street. My first call was to Chloe. "I know," she said the moment she picked up. Her voice was thin, trembling. The detective called me 10 minutes ago. Mark, I'm at work. I can't breathe. I feel like I'm back in the snow." "Listen to me," I said, my voice dropping into that low, tactical register I'd hoped to forget. "He's barred from leaving his county. That's 6 hours away. He doesn't have a car, he doesn't have money, and he's on a short leash with a parole officer. You are safe in this city. He doesn't even know where you live now." "He'll find out," she whispered. "People like him always find out." "He won't. I'm coming to pick you up. We're going to my house. We're going to sit down. We're going to look at the security feeds, and we're going to realize that we are prepared. We aren't the same people we were a year ago, Chloe." I picked her up, and we spent the evening in my living room. Sarah was quiet, but her face a mask of controlled anxiety as she held Maya. The atmosphere in the house had shifted instantly. The fortress was no longer a metaphor. It was a reality again. I spent 2 hours testing the backup batteries on the floodlights and checking the tension on the window locks. But as I reached for the safe to check a Glock, Sarah caught my hand. "Don't," she said. "I'm just checking the action, Sarah. It's been sitting for months." "Mark, look at us," she said, gesturing to Chloe, who was curled up in a chair, staring at nothing, and then to Maya, who was happily playing with a set of plastic keys on the rug. "If you bring that gun out right now, he wins. He isn't even in the same zip code, and he's already inside this house. He's already making you go back to that dark place." I looked at the safe. The cold steel felt like a magnet. I wanted the weight of the weapon in my hand. I wanted the certainty of it. But I looked at Maya. She was laughing, a pure, bubbly sound that didn't know anything about Victor or parole boards or search warrants. "You're right," I said, pulling my hand away. The next 3 days were a test of endurance. Every time the news mentioned a parolee or a local crime, Chloe would flinch. Every time a car with a loud exhaust passed the house, I'd find myself at the window, my hand hovering near the curtain. On Thursday, I received a package. No return address. Just a small, padded envelope. My heart hammered against my ribs as I took it to the garage. I didn't open it in the house. I used a box cutter, my breath shallow. Inside was a single item, a small silver cat bell, the kind you'd put on a collar. There was no note. The message was crystal clear. "I know about the cat. I know you were there. I haven't forgotten. I didn't tell the women. I couldn't." Chloe was finally starting to eat again, and Sarah was just beginning to trust that I wouldn't spend every night patrolling the perimeter. I tucked the bell into my pocket, the tiny metallic jingle sounding like a death knell. I drove to Mac's gym that night. It was late, the neon sign flickering. Mac was closing up, throwing a bag of trash into the bin. "You look like you saw a ghost," Mac said, wiping his brow. "The ghost is out of the bottle," I said. "He sent me a gift today." Mac stopped. He looked at me, then at the quiet street. "You want to go back to the alley, Mark? You want to finish what you started?" "I want him to leave us alone," I said, my voice cracking. "Why, I paid the debt. I've done everything right. Why does he get to keep coming back?" "Because guys like that don't have anything else," Mac said, stepping closer. "They don't have a wife or a kid or a future. All they have is the grudge. It's the only thing that keeps them warm. So what do? I can't live like this for the rest of my life. I can't jump every time a bell rings." Mac reached out and put a heavy hand on my shoulder. "You stop playing his game. He sent that bell because he wants you to come to him. He wants you to lose your cool, break your parole-free record, and end up in the cell next to him. He's fishing, Mark. Don't bite the hook." I drove home, the silver bell heavy in my pocket. When I got inside, the house was dark. I walked into the nursery and stood over Maya's crib. She was fast asleep. Then her tiny hand curled into a fist. I took a bell out of my pocket. I looked at it in the dim glow of the nightlight. Then I walked into the kitchen, opened the trash can, and buried it deep under the coffee grounds and the diaper scraps. I didn't check the locks. I didn't look at the cameras. I went to bed and pulled Sarah close. 2 weeks passed. No more packages. No more breather calls. The silence was agonizing, but I held the line. I refused to be the aggressor. Then, on a Saturday morning, Chloe came into the kitchen holding her phone. Her face was pale, but she wasn't crying. "Mark, look at this." She showed me a local news link from Victor's county. "Parolee arrested in high-speed chase. Victor Volkov, 34, taken into custody after violating parole and assaulting a peace officer. In sentence expected to be doubled. He'd cracked. He couldn't help himself. He was a creature of violence, and without me there to provide a target, he'd turned that violence back on the world that was trying to keep him contained. He'd chased a ghost, and the ghost had led him straight back to a cage. The relief that washed over the kitchen was physical. Chloe sank into a chair, letting out a long, shuddering breath. Sarah walked over and hugged her, then looked at me. "He's gone, Mark," Sarah said. "Truly gone?" I nodded, but I didn't feel the rush of victory I'd expected. I just felt tired. I walked out to the porch and sat on the steps. The sun was warm, the neighbors were mowing their lawns, and a delivery truck was rumbling down the street. The ordinary guy was still there. He was a little more scarred, a little more cynical, and he still had $8,000 in credit card debt. But he was also a man who knew how to protect what mattered. I thought about the $2,400 I'd spent on tips the year before. I thought about the $600 CV axle, the $15 hospital contribution, and the silver bell in the trash. Life is a series of costs. Some you pay in money, some you pay in blood, and some you pay in the quiet, steady resolve to stay human when everything is trying to turn you into a monster. I got up, went inside, and started making a grocery list. We needed milk, diapers, and maybe a nice bottle of wine. It was a Saturday after all, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't look at the total. I just looked at the people I was buying it for. 1 year after the day Victor's second arrest hit the news, I found myself standing in the middle of a bustling park on a Saturday afternoon. Maya was toddling through the grass, her tiny sneakers squeaking with every uneven step, and Sarah was sitting on a blanket nearby, laughing as Chloe tried to keep Mochi, now comfortably harnessed, from chasing a particularly brave squirrel. The world hadn't changed much. The economy was still a roller coaster. The service fee on restaurant bills had climbed to 5%, and the tablets were still everywhere, their digital eyes begging for 25% for a prepackaged muffin. But I had changed. The $8,000 debt was gone. It hadn't happened through a windfall or a miracle. It happened through the slow, disciplined grind of a man who had reclaimed his own agency. We stopped eating out 3 times a week. We stopped paying for the convenience of not having to look people in the eye. We learned that no is a complete sentence, one that doesn't require an apology or a justification. I looked at my hand. The knuckles were still a bit thick from my time at Mac's, but the tremors were long gone. I didn't carry the Glock in the car anymore. It was locked in a safe at home, a tool I hope to never touch again, but one I no longer fear. "Hey, Mark," Chloe called out, waving me over. "We're thinking of grabbing ice cream from the stand by the pond. You coming?" I walked over, scooped Maya up into my arms, and felt her sticky, sun-warmed cheek against mine. "Ice cream sounds perfect." We walked to the little wooden stand. The line was long, and the teenager behind the counter was working solo. His face flushed as he scooped flavor flavor after flavor for a group of rowdy kids. He was efficient, polite, and he didn't miss a beat when a customer changed their mind at the last second. When it was my turn, the bill came to $14. The kid spun the tablet around. 18%, 20%, 25%. I looked at the screen. For a split second, the ghost of the old Mark, the one who tipped out of fear, flickered in my mind. Then I looked at the kid. He was working hard. He wasn't demanding a subsidy. He was just doing his job in the heat. I hit custom. I typed in $5. It wasn't a percentage. It wasn't a suggested amount. It was a direct gift from one human being to another because I recognized the effort. I wasn't being bullied into it by software, and I wasn't doing it to avoid a confrontation. I was doing it because I chose to. As we sat by the water and eating our melting cones, I realized what the experiment had really taught me. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the tipping culture. It was about the difference between being a consumer and being a person. For years, I'd been a consumer, someone who let the world dictate the price of my conscience. I'd paid for the right to be liked, the right to be safe, and the right to be invisible. But the moment I stopped, I had to start standing on my own feet. I had to learn how to defend my home, how to protect my friends, and how to look at a bill and see a transaction instead of a moral judgment. You're thinking again, Sarah said, nudging my shoulder. Just thinking about how much I like this life, I said. Even with the $5 ice cream? Especially with the $5 ice cream. The sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, golden shadows across the park. Chloe was packing up the cat's gear. Sarah was gathering Maya's toys, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel the need to scan the perimeter. I knew that somewhere, thousands of miles away, or maybe just around the corner, there were people like Victor. There were systems designed to drain you and tablets designed to guilt you, but they didn't have power over me anymore. I was an ordinary guy. I was a father. I was a husband, and I knew exactly what my life was worth. I took the last bite of my cone, stood up, and helped my family pack up. We walked toward the car, leaving the park behind. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I was finally moving forward, and for once, the road ahead didn't cost a thing.